Thanks for watching Almost Professional Photoshop. Let's take a look at taking beauty from the rubble. So first off, in this layer, we need to do a couple things. The things that stand out to me is she's kind of a hazy. There's some low contrast to her. And we need to change some things about how she's blended into the scene. I think that's the biggest offender here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so we can see her nice and close. I think looking at the shadow, we did a really good job here of the shadow layer. That shadow looks like it's the direct angle where her heels and her body would be. I think that's about right. Not sure where this layer comes in here a little bit. That seems a little bit off because her hand's here. But it looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and just erase part of that a little bit. But I also noticed the shadow thickness, so the darkness is a little bit off. How do we gauge it? Looking at this pillar cast in shadow right here, it is darker here than it is here. So I'm going to come up to our blending mode. And I'm going to go ahead and I could change to different blending mode. That's maybe an option, but I think multiply is probably the way to go. I think that helped to darken a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and change my opacity. There's much darker. Is it quite right? Maybe it's a little bit too dark now, but I think it will go like 92, let's say. I think that helps give it a darker flavor from where it was to there. The idea is we're trying to mimic everything that's in the scene. We're trying to match it to make it look realistic. Everything we do in Photoshop, we can do amazing things. In this type of work, we're looking realism. We wanted to make it look believable. We have some artistic license as we shape some things, but we want to make it look like it could have been photographed, and we can't even tell it's fake. But we know it is. So we have the shadow here. Darken that layer a little bit is good. We have the girls layer. I wish we had actually masked it out so I could actually adjust it and see where the picture was, but it actually looks like they did a good job masking it out as well. I wouldn't say necessarily perfect because it does look like part of her dress has actually been clipped out. We just see a little bit of nip in her dress, so I can't bring that back because it's been edited out. But I think the cutout's pretty good on her. Part of the problem is we see these other two layers is she was lit somewhat from behind and somewhat from the side. And so by side and behind, the problem is it doesn't look like she belongs in the scene. The light's not quite right. The light's coming from the side. We're not going to have light on the top of her head. So I think we could definitely change some of that. The hair's flowing. We can darken some of this. We can darken the top. There is some light from behind her, so we could have some light maybe on her bicep here and on her forearm and maybe even a little bit on her hand. But we can try to play with that as we go. So this layer is pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just delete these layers and start over. The clipping mask, which is the good thing. So I have the layer of hair here. I'm going to go ahead and start with a clipping mask of probably a curves layer. I'm going to darken this down a little bit. Right now everything's getting super dark. I go back to my mask principles. By clicking the mask, invert, nothing's happening. Now I have a blank layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and paint back white with a brush. Hit B or get your B for your brush setting here. I'm going to go ahead and paint white back. So come here with the white brush, and where I paint now, that is actually going to happen. Also notice I'm painting anywhere in the scene is also doing that. I don't want to do that as well. Bring up my opacity a bit. And I don't want to do that way. I want to do it so it's only adhering to the girl. That's called the clipping mask. I'll right click on here. And the girl's right underneath her. Go to right click, create clipping mask. And now it's only touching her. The area that I painted outside the lines is no longer there. It's beautiful, helps you keep all your paint inside the line, saves you time, makes it more believable. So we have the layer there. That looks pretty good. Not perfect yet, but we're getting there. Maybe touch a little bit there, and maybe a little bit on her hand. There's some light coming from everywhere, and definitely need to darken the dress a little bit because it's hidden from the shadow. I'm going to use a nice large brush here. The larger the brush, the softer the shadow. I have to paint back some of that because I'm touching more parts than I'd rather not. Something like that. And now I'm going to go ahead and paint back with a smaller brush, with black, parts that I want to keep shadow. I don't want all of her getting that dark necessarily. Bring back a little bit here, maybe a little bit from the hair from the window. I don't want her to be as much on the hair because this light is just beautifully covering her from the window, from the left. We want some of that to hit. Some of that's not going to hit her head. We're aware of that. Maybe tone that down so we're getting a little more on the brush. Something like that. It's a subtle thing. And I'm not going to go that intense. It's a little bit much. So I'm going to go ahead and to my curves layer and go ahead and bring that up a little bit. And some layers starts to look fake. We don't want to do that. I'm going to bring it up a little bit, about there, on and off. That's just gradually helping there. Because I want to maybe go the hair a little bit darker, what I'm going to do is go ahead and darken it down. And then come back to my mask. And I'm going to paint black with like a 50% brush. So it's not going to affect really her much there. It's more going to keep it dark on the hair. So it's still affecting the dress at some level, but it still kept the hair fairly dark at the top with one layer. Otherwise, you have to create two different layers, and it's just more complicated and more time consuming. That looks pretty good. I think that layer really does help. And I'm going to go ahead and paint in on her legs, create a little more shadow. The light's going to come from the left. So I'm going to create a small brush here. Paint a little bit with a white brush on her calf. That's a little bit too much. I'm going to turn down my opacity. Since I have a gradual opacity, I'm going to only do it a little bit. My opacity brush, kind of darken some of that calf a little bit. Because it's not hitting all of her foot or her shoe. The bottom of the shoe is going to be a little dark as well. And the same thing for this calf. Darken it a little bit on the edge here, just to help it kind of pull in a little bit. I'm doing a click and drag. I don't want to do too many clicks or it's going to become too obvious of an effect, and I don't want that at all. Something like that. A couple clicks. I want a little more intensity there. And let's see how that looks. I think that helps. Helps shade the whole body. Before we kind of had a harsher on the dress shadow and it looked a little bit too much. That can help. And maybe we could even brighten the hair and the hand a little bit. So let's do one more layer. We'll do a levels, brighten. Remember, I need to make a clipping mask. Right click and clipping mask. And now I can paint black where I want her to be, on her hand or on her forearm. So I'm going to paint black. Oh, first I'm going to go ahead and invert it. Invert it, so now it's black. Now I'm going to paint white to bring that back a little bit. Now I'm using a pretty low opacity brush to bring that back a bit. And I really want to highlight that beautiful hair that's being lit up from the window. Maybe add a little light sparkling onto her as well. Good. Something like that. That looks pretty good. Maybe even bring back a little bit on the brush. Just a little bit on the dress, something like that. The larger the brush, the larger the feather, but I don't want to hit the hand too much. Just subtly bring that back so that dress is just glowing in there. And that layer is subtle. One layer to brighten, one layer to darken. Kind of like a back and forth. Almost like, I guess, like a dance. You're back and forth. There's a swaying back and forth between the effects, the layers. And that makes a big difference by brightening up portions and darkening up portions. Huge layer from here to there. Now it looks like the light is coming from the left and not so much from the right. So what is left? Well, I think we could also go ahead and probably soften some of the background, because part of it is the fact that she's lit and photographed separately, and the whole background has lots of depth of field. Lots of this rundown cathedral or whatever building this is falling apart, and it's sharp in the picture. So to emphasize her more, we can darken and or blur the background to help draw more attention to her. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and take my background layer. I'm going to unlock it. I have my layer here. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to convert to Smart Object. Now that it's so intelligent, now we can do effects to it. Smart Object, we see that with a little icon. We go to Filter, we go to Blur, and I can choose any type of blur. Lens blur is probably okay, but it won't let you do that under a Smart Object. So I'm going to do Gaussian blur, box blur, a couple different ones. We'll do box blur today. And let's do box blur, and let's do like 7 pixels. Now this is salt and pepper taste. We can change it later. Actually, let's do 10 for now. I'll actually do 13 for now. Nice and bold. I'm going to edit it later, so don't worry. So now I have a smart object. You can see here in this filter, it's got a smart object and a smart filter. So I can edit this filter as well. So I have box blur filter here. I'm going to come into my effects. I'm going to take a black brush, and where I paint black, it's not going to blur. It's going to keep the effect from happening. Now, some people will come in with a gradient layer, and some layers this could work. But right now, a gradient layer isn't quite what I'm looking for. But as a gradient layer, might help for now. Maybe I'll start here. I can adjust that a little bit, something like that. So in the gradient layer, the longer or the shorter the gradient, the more less or the gradual the blur. That might do a pretty good job. At least start me here. I can adjust it more with a brush. But I want to keep it sharp, probably closer to her. Start to blur that a little bit. If I change the angle, that'll change the amount of blurriness on the sides. The blurriness. I don't think that's an official word. See what the captions does with that one. Something like that. And that's starting to gradually change it a little bit. Now the problem with this technique is this pillar is close to her here, but it's also just as soft as the background from the pillar. So I might want to take a brush, and I do want to take a brush, click my mask, go to my brush layer. I'm going to create a black layer with my brush, 49% opacity, and I'm going to start to paint back where I want it to be sharp. Because I don't want it to be completely sharp. I don't want even all that sharp, like 33%. Sharply starting to sharpen it gradually in different portions. Like there. I want this window to be bright and sharp because that's an important part. Brighten here. Zoom out a little bit so I can see the whole picture. Sharpen from there. I think that's good. Now I could leave the ceiling soft, and I probably could. It's not what would happen in a real photograph, but I think brightening or sharpening the ceiling wouldn't necessarily be the best option here. And that looks pretty good. And maybe even darken the foreground. So I'm going to paint white with a fairly soft brush and start to soften the foreground just a little bit. That's going to put more attention to where she is because now she's sharper than her surroundings. Turn that layer on and off, pretty gradual, and crank it up a lot just so we can see the effect. We can see now by cranking the effect, where are the blurry areas? Getting pretty hazy, yep. That's blurry. That's kind of where I want the sharpness and softness to be. I could repaint it back a little bit if I wanted. I'm going to go to my brush setting. I'm going to go to my box blur, and I'm going to change it back to maybe like 10. I kind of like it about 10. Maybe a little bit intense, maybe do like 8. So that's a subtle technique, but it brings her out more. I'm not changing the sharpness around her, but by blurring its surroundings, she stands out more. It's an artistic technique. They teach you that in painting school. That looks pretty good. And if I wanted to for this layer, I'm going to go ahead and create a little bit of a touch-up someone did. That's great. The student did a touch-up. So I'm going to go ahead and darken this layer a little bit. Go to my curves. And I can darken it a little bit. If I go too much, it's obviously way too much. Take it back to my white. I'm going to flip it to invert. So nothing's happening at this point. Now I want to darken. The ceiling's bright. The ceiling doesn't have to be bright. So I'm going to go ahead and paint white on the ceiling to kind of gradually darken where I don't want people to look. Again, all to that art training that you may have, or just now you're learning through some of these techniques. Darkening some of that. Darkening maybe the edge of this pillar. Where do I want to de-emphasize something? I can do that with this layer. Emphasize layer, de-emphasize layer. Turn that layer on and off. That's subtle. It's subtle, but it's sweet. It's the little differences that make a big difference in the whole picture. In thinking whole picture, let's take a look at before and after. So here is before, and here is after. What do you think? Before and after, close up, makes a big difference overall. Thanks for watching. Better picks in just a few clicks. If you have any comments, please put them below, and I'd like to have that dialogue with you about what you like and maybe what you don't like. Go ahead and hit that thumbs up, give me a subscribe, and I'd appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.